Behind the brooding eyes and mumbled words that revolutionized acting forever, Marlon Brando harbored secrets that Hollywood's golden age desperately tried to bury. For decades, the man who gave us Stanley Kowalski and Vito Corleone lived a double life so complex, so riddled with contradictions and hidden truths, that even his closest friends barely scratched the surface. Today, after years of silence and speculation, we finally peel back the curtain on the real Marlon Brando, the man whose personal demons were as powerful as his legendary performances, and whose hidden struggles would ultimately define both his greatest triumphs and most devastating failures. Long before Marlon Brando became the godfather of modern acting, he was simply but a wounded child growing up in the cornfields of Nebraska, carrying scars that would never fully heal. Born in 1924 to an alcoholic mother and an absent father, young Marlon learned early that survival meant wearing masks, becoming whoever the moment demanded him to be. What the world didn't know was that Brando's revolutionary method acting wasn't just a technique, it was a desperate escape from a reality too painful to face. His childhood home in Omaha was a battleground where his mother Dorothy, a once promising actress, drowned her broken dreams in bottles of gin, while his father, Marlon Sr., disappeared into work and affairs, leaving behind a family fractured beyond repair. The teenage Brando, who arrived in New York in 1943, wasn't the confident rebel the press would later celebrate. He was a lost soul, carrying his mother's unfulfilled artistic aspirations and his father's emotional abandonment like invisible chains. Little did the world know that every character he would later inhabit on screen was, in part, an attempt to escape the character he could never quite master himself. His roommates at the time remember a young man who could transform before their eyes, shifting from charming and magnetic to brooding and unreachable within moments. This wasn't just artistic temperament, it was the survival mechanism of someone who had learned that showing your true self meant risking complete rejection. The method wasn't just his craft, it was his camouflage, allowing him to hide in plain sight while the world applauded his authenticity. Even then, those closest to him sensed something deeper, something darker, lurking beneath the surface of his meteoric rise to fame. The night of December 3, 1947, would forever change not just Marlon Brando's life, but the very DNA of American theater. As the curtain rose on A Streetcar Named Desire, audiences had no idea they were about to witness the birth of a new kind of masculinity, raw, dangerous, and utterly magnetic. But what they couldn't see was the torment behind Stanley's animalistic rage. Tennessee Williams had written Stanley as a brute. But Brando understood something deeper about the character that even the playwright initially missed. He saw in Stanley the same wounded masculinity that plagued his own father, the desperate need to control what you fear losing, the violence that erupts when vulnerability threatens to surface. Night after night, Brando didn't just play Stanley. He excavated him from the deepest, darkest corners of his own family trauma. Jessica Tandy, who played Blanche opposite Brando's Stanley, later revealed in private letters that were only discovered decades later how disturbed she was by Brando's commitment to the role. He doesn't turn it off, she wrote to her husband. Even between scenes, there's something predatory in his eyes, as if Stanley has possessed him completely. What she witnessed was Brando's dangerous gift and cursive disappearing so completely into his characters that the line between performance and reality began to blur. The critics called it revolutionary. They praised his naturalistic approach, his ability to bring real emotion to the stage. But those who knew him intimately understood the terrible cost. Brando was channeling years of suppressed rage, childhood helplessness, and generational trauma. Each performance was both artistic triumph and psychological excavation, leaving him drained and increasingly dependent on the very characters that made him famous. As Broadway audiences gave him standing ovations night after night, Brando would return to his small apartment and stare at himself in the mirror, wondering who he was when he wasn't being someone else. When Marlon Brando stepped off the train in Los Angeles in 1949, Hollywood had no idea what was coming. The studio system was built on manufactured, stars polished, predictable, and controllable. Brando was none of these things. He was a force of nature, wrapped in a and the earthquake he was about to cause would reshape Tinseltown forever. But beneath the rebel image that the publicity machine quickly crafted lay a man, increasingly uncomfortable in his own skin. The same vulnerability that made his performances so electric made his real life a minefield of complications. Studio executives, accustomed to starlets who followed orders and leading men who played by the rules, found themselves dealing with someone who seemed allergic to authority and tradition. What they didn't understand, what perhaps even Brando himself didn't fully grasp, was that his rebelliousness wasn't just artistic integrity, it was the desperate flailing of someone who had never learned how to be genuine in his own life, only in his roles. The contracts, the publicity tours, the carefully orchestrated interviews, all of it felt like another kind of performance. but one where he couldn't access the truth that made his acting so powerful. His first Hollywood relationships reflected this confusion. He was drawn to women who were as complex and damaged as he was actresses who understood the particular loneliness of living multiple lives simultaneously. But he was also terrified of genuine intimacy, having learned early that showing your true self was the fastest way to be abandoned. The press began to notice the contradictions. Here was Hollywood's newest golden boy who seemed to actively despise everything that had made him famous. He would show up to premieres in torn jeans, give interviews where he mumbled incomprehensibly, and openly mocked the very films that were making him rich and famous. What looked like arrogance was actually armor protection against a world that wanted to consume him but had no interest in understanding him. By 1954, Marlon Brando had achieved what every actor dreams of: critical acclaim, box office success, and the kind of cultural influence that comes along once in a generation. On the Waterfront had just earned him his first Academy Award, and Hollywood was his kingdom. But success, for Brando, felt more like a trap than a triumph. Those closest to him during this period remember a man increasingly at war with himself. The same intensity that made his performances unforgettable was consuming him from the inside. He began to gain weight, not the gradual expansion of middle age, but the rapid, substantial gain of someone using food as medication for pain that had no name. His eating wasn't just about pleasure, or even comfort, it was about disappearing. Every pound was another layer between him and a world that demanded too much, expected too much, and understood too little. The handsome rebel of the Wild One was slowly burying himself alive, and only a few people recognized it as the cry for help it actually was. Friends from this era, speaking anonymously decades later, described dinner parties where Brando would consume enormous quantities of food with an almost mechanical precision, as if he were feeding something much larger than hunger. It wasn't gluttony, one close friend revealed. It was like watching someone try to fill a hole that went all the way through them. The studio system, which had never quite known what to do with Brando's authenticity, now had to grapple with his transformation. Costume departments began letting out suits. Cinematographers learned new angles to minimize his expanding frame. But no one addressed the obvious question: why was Hollywood's most magnetic star systematically destroying the very thing that made him irresistible? The answer lay buried in childhood trauma that would take decades to fully understand, and in a relationship with fame that was more like a chronic illness than a blessing. Marlon Brando's romantic life read like a Tennessee Williams play, passionate, destructive, and absolutely mesmerizing. But beneath the headlines about his affairs with leading ladies and his multiple marriages, lay a more complicated truth about a man who desperately craved connection but seemed incapable of sustaining it. His first marriage to Anna Kashfi in 1957 was doomed from the start, though nobody understood why at the time. Anna, an actress with her own complicated relationship with truth and identity, was drawn to Brando's intensity but unprepared for the emotional chaos that surrounded him like a storm system. Their relationship was volcanic explosive passion, followed by equally explosive conflicts. All played out under the merciless glare of Hollywood publicity. What the gossip columns couldn't capture was the deeper tragedy unfolding behind closed doors. Brando, who could inhabit any character on screen with breathtaking authenticity, seemed unable to figure out how to be himself in his own relationships. He would retreat into personas even with those he loved most, leaving partners feeling like they were in relationships with ghosts. Anna later revealed, in interviews that wouldn't surface until decades after their bitter divorce, that Brando would sometimes speak to her entirely in character, channeling Stanley Kowalski during arguments, or retreating into the wounded sensitivity of Terry Malloy when faced with emotional demands. "I never knew who I was married to," she said. "Some days I wasn't even sure he knew." The pattern would repeat with his subsequent relationships and marriages. Women were drawn to his magnetism, his talent, and the promise of reaching the wounded soul they sensed beneath his performances. But Brando seemed constitutionally unable to let anyone get close enough to see him without a mask. Love for him became another kind of performance, one where he never quite learned his lines. The tragedy wasn't just personal. Each failed relationship reinforced his belief that genuine intimacy was impossible, that he was fundamentally unlovable when he wasn't being someone else. Perhaps no aspect of Marlon Brando's hidden life was more heartbreaking than his relationship with his children. Here was a man who could channel infinite tenderness on screen, who could make audiences weep with his portrayals of vulnerability and love, but who struggled desperately to translate those emotions into his real-life role as a father. Brando had 11 children with various women, and each relationship reflected his own fractured understanding of family. Having grown up with an alcoholic mother and an emotionally absent father, he had no template for healthy parenthood. Instead, he oscillated between smothering attention and complete disappearance, lavishing his children with gifts and grand gestures, while remaining fundamentally unavailable for the day-to-day, emotional labor of raising them. His son, Christian, born in 1958, became the tragic focal point of Brando's parental struggles. Christian inherited not only his father's striking looks, but also his capacity for self-destruction. As Christian grew older, it became clear that he was caught in the same generational cycle of trauma that had shaped Brando's own childhood, abandoned by an emotionally distant father who was more comfortable playing fathers on screen than being one in real life. Friends from the 1960s and 70s remember Brando's anguish over his children, particularly Christian. He would speak for hours about his desire to be a better father than his own had been, but seemed incapable of translating that intention into consistent action. The same man who could spend months preparing for a role would flee his own home. When the emotional demands of parenthood became too intense, the irony was devastating. Brando's most acclaimed performances often centered on themes of family, loyalty, and protective love. Don Corleone's fierce devotion to his children in The Godfather felt so authentic because Brando understood, with painful clarity, what that kind of love should look like, even though he couldn't seem to access it in his own life. In 1966, Marlon Brando made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He purchased Titiaroa, a small atoll in French Polynesia, and began what many saw as his retreat from the world that had made him famous. But Titiaroa wasn't just an island paradise, it was the physical manifestation of Brando's desperate desire to escape, not just Hollywood, but himself. The island purchase came at a time when Brando's career was in decline and his personal life was in chaos. The method acting that had revolutionized American cinema was being replaced by new styles and younger actors. The rebel who had once been Hollywood's most exciting star was increasingly seen as difficult, unpredictable, and uncommercial. Titiaroa offered something he couldn't find anywhere else: the possibility of complete reinvention. But even in paradise, Brando couldn't escape the patterns that had defined his life. He populated the island with a rotating cast of friends, lovers, and hangers-on, creating a kind of intentional family that reflected his lifelong inability to sustain genuine intimacy. People came and went from Titiaroa like actors in a play, each serving a temporary role in Brando's ongoing performance of contentment. The island years revealed both the best and worst of Brando's character. He became genuinely passionate about environmental causes and Polynesian culture, using his fame to advocate for indigenous rights and conservation. But he also became increasingly reclusive and eccentric, gaining enormous amounts of weight and retreating so far from his former life that some wondered if he was having a complete breakdown. Letters from this period, discovered after his death, reveal a man both liberated and haunted by his isolation. "I can be anyone here," he wrote to an old friend, "but I still don't know who I am when I'm no one at all." The island that was supposed to provide answers had only deepened the questions about who Marlon Brando really was beneath all the masks. The 1970s should have been Marlon Brando's renaissance. Francis Ford Coppola's The Godfather offered him a role perfectly suited to his evolved presence, man carrying the weight of history, power, and terrible secrets. But what audiences saw as a masterful performance was actually something much more complex, a man playing a character who wasn't so different from himself. Vito Corleone was, like Brando, someone who had built an empire while losing his soul. The Don's famous line about keeping his friends close and his enemies closer could have been Brando's personal philosophy. He had spent decades surrounding himself with people while never letting anyone truly know him. The performance worked so well because it wasn't entirely acting. It was Brando finally finding a character that matched his own internal landscape. But success brought its own problems. The Academy Award for The Godfather should have been a triumphant return to form. Instead, Brando sent Native American activist Soshin Littlefeather to refuse the award in protest of Hollywood's treatment of indigenous peoples. The gesture was both principled and self-sabotaging, a perfect encapsulation of Brando's relationship with his own success. The weight gain that had begun in the 1950s had accelerated dramatically by this point. Brando at his heaviest weight, over 350 pounds, and his eating had become both a public spectacle and a private tragedy. Costume designers created elaborate workarounds. Directors learned to shoot around his size. But no one addressed the obvious truth: America's greatest actor was literally consuming himself. Those who worked with him during this period described a man of extraordinary intelligence and creativity who seemed to be at war with his own body and talent. He would deliver moments of pure brilliance, followed by behavior so erratic and self-destructive that it seemed almost calculated to undermine his own success. What the world celebrated as Marlon Brando's revolutionary approach to act, ability to disappear completely into characters, was actually a sophisticated form of dissociation that had its roots in childhood trauma. The method that made him famous was also slowly destroying him from the inside. Stella Adler, his most influential teacher, had recognized early that Brando's gift was also his curse. Unlike other method actors who drew from personal experience to inform their characters, Brando seemed to use characters to escape from personal experience. Each role became a temporary refuge from a self he found increasingly unbearable. Acting coaches who worked with Brando in later years described a process that bordered on the supernatural. He would arrive at rehearsals as himself charming, intelligent, slightly distant, but as he slipped into character, something profound would happen. His entire physical presence would change. His voice would alter. Even his facial structures seemed to shift subtly. He wasn't just playing characters, he was becoming them so completely that the original Marlon would virtually disappear. The problem was that this process, while creating unforgettable performances, was also preventing him from developing a stable sense of self. He had become so skilled at being other people that he had never learned how to be comfortable being himself. Off camera, between roles, he existed in a kind of limbo, not quite anyone, not quite no one. This explains many of the contradictions that puzzled those who knew him. He could be incredibly empathetic when channeling a character's emotions, but seemed almost incapable of accessing his own feelings directly. He could embody authentic masculinity on screen while struggling with gender identity and sexual confusion in his personal life. The method had given him everything he thought he wanted, while taking away the one thing he actually needed, a sense of who he was when he wasn't performing. One of Marlon Brando's most closely guarded secrets was his lifelong struggle with sexual and gender identity. In an era when such fluidity was not just taboo but potentially career-ending, Brando navigated a complex inner landscape that would remain largely hidden until decades after his death. Those closest to him knew that Brando's sexuality defied easy categorization. He was attracted to women, but also to men, and seemed most comfortable in relationships that existed outside traditional boundaries. His most lasting romantic connection wasn't with any of his wives, but with Wally Cox, his childhood friend and roommate, whose death in 1973 devastated Brando in ways that few understood at the time. The relationship with Cox was the closest Brando ever came to genuine intimacy. Cox, a gentle comedian known for playing meek characters on television, was everything Brando wasn't: consistent, emotionally available, and comfortable with himself. Their connection transcended sexual categories and gave Brando a glimpse of what authentic love might feel like without the performance and drama that characterized his other relationships. But even this relationship carried the weight of secrets. In the 1950s and 60s, any hint of homosexual or bisexual behavior could destroy a career, especially for someone like Brando, who had built his image on a particular kind of aggressive masculinity. The same man who had revolutionized how men could be emotional and vulnerable on screen was trapped by social expectations that demanded rigid heterosexual performance in his public life. This internal tension manifested in various ways throughout his life. His weight gain can be understood partly as an attempt to hide his body, to make himself less sexual and therefore less threatening to his own confused sense of identity. His retreat to Titiaroa offered not just geographical distance from Hollywood's judgment, but also the freedom to explore relationships and identity without the constant scrutiny of the American press. The tragedy was that Brando, who had taught the world that authentic emotion could be powerful and beautiful, felt he had to hide his most authentic self from that same world. The most devastating chapter of Marlon Brando's hidden life unfolded on May 16, 1990. When his son Christian shot and killed Dag Dralat, the boyfriend of Christian's half-sister Cheyenne, in the family's Mulholland Drive home. The incident would expose decades of family dysfunction and force Brando to confront the ways his own damage had been passed down to the next generation. Christian claimed he was protecting Cheyenne from an abusive relationship, but the truth was far more complex. The Brando children had grown up in a household where violence and drama were normalized, where emotional boundaries were non-existent, and where their father's fame both protected and isolated them from the consequences of their actions. For Brando, Christian's crime was the ultimate reckoning. Here was undeniable proof that his attempts to be a better father than his own had failed catastrophically. The same generational trauma that had shaped his own childhood, the alcoholism, the emotional abandonment, the confusion of love with chaos, had claimed another victim. The trial became a media circus, with Brando's every appearance scrutinized and analyzed. But those who were there remember a man who seemed to age years and months, carrying the weight not just of his son's crime but of his own complicity in creating the circumstances that led to it. His testimony on Christian's behalf was father, desperately trying to save a son he had never quite learned how to love properly. Cheyenne's subsequent suicide in 1995 completed the tragedy. Unable to cope with the guilt and trauma surrounding Drolet's death, she hanged herself in her mother's home in Tahiti. Brando had now lost 2 children, one to prison, one to death, and both losses felt like direct consequences of his own inability to break the cycle of family dysfunction. The man who had given the world some of its most powerful portrayals of family loyalty and protective love had been unable to protect his own family from the very forces he portrayed so convincingly on screen. Marlon Brando's last major film role, in The Score 2001, was both a fitting capstone to his career and a painful reflection of what he had become. Playing an aging thief, planning one final heist, Brando was essentially playing himself a legend whose best days were behind him, still possessing flashes of his former brilliance but operating in the shadow of past glory. The production was notoriously difficult. Brando, now in his late 70s and weighing well over 300 pounds, was dealing with diabetes, heart problems, and the accumulated physical toll of decades of self-abuse. But more challenging than his health issues was his apparent disinterest in the craft that had once consumed him. He would arrive on set unprepared, rely heavily on cue cards, and seem genuinely confused about why he was there. Director Frank Oz later revealed that working with Brando was like trying to direct a ghost. The man was physically present but seemed to be inhabiting his own body reluctantly, going through the motions of a career that no longer held meaning for him. Co-star Robert De Niro, a devoted student of Brando's early work, was reportedly devastated to see his idol in such decline. But even in this diminished state, Brando could still access the magic that had made him legendary. There were moments during the filming of the score when the old Brando would suddenly appear a line reading that cut straight to the heart, a gesture that revealed volumes about his character's inner life. These flashes were brief but powerful enough to remind everyone present why they were in the business of making movies in the first place. The tragedy wasn't just that Brando's skills had diminished with a dull actor's face that reality. The tragedy was that he seemed to have lost faith in the very thing that had given his life meaning. Acting, which had once been his salvation and his prison, had become simply another burden to bear. By the final decade of his life, Marlon Brando's relationship with food had become the most visible symbol of his internal struggles. Weighing over 350 pounds and struggling with diabetes, he was literally carrying the weight of a lifetime of suppressed emotions, unprocessed trauma, and unfulfilled longing. Those who cared for him during these years described eating patterns that went far beyond simple overeating. Brando would consume enormous quantities of food with an almost desperate urgency, as if he were trying to fill not just his stomach but some vast emptiness that no amount of consumption could satisfy. Ice cream by the gallon, entire chickens, eaten in single sittings, massive quantities of his beloved peanut butter and jam. The portions were as excessive as they were self-destructive. But the weight wasn't just about food, it was about protection, insulation from a world that had demanded too much for too long. Each pound was another barrier between himself and the expectations, the scrutiny, and the painful vulnerability that authentic connection required. He had spent his career stripping away pretense to reveal raw human truth, but in his personal life, he was building walls as fast as he could construct them. His doctors begged him to address his eating, but Brando seemed incapable of understanding. Food is anything other than medication for pain that had no other cure. Friends staged interventions, nutritionists were hired and fired. Diet programs were started and abandoned. Nothing worked because nothing addressed the real problem. Brando was trying to eat his way out of existence, to become so large and unwieldy that the world would simply leave him alone. The most heartbreaking aspect was that even at his heaviest, flashes of the old charisma would still break through. A smile, a gesture, a moment of genuine connection would remind people of the magnificent man hidden beneath layers of protection he no longer knew how to remove. Marlon Brando died on July 1, 2004, at the age of 80. In the UCLA Medical Center where he had been battling pulmonary fibrosis. But in many ways, the man the world had fallen in love with had been dying for decades, slowly disappearing beneath the weight of secrets, trauma, and the impossible burden of being a legend, when all he had ever wanted was to be human. The last few years of his life were marked by increasing isolation and physical decline. He rarely left his Mulholland Drive home, seeing only a small circle of caregivers and hangers-on who had learned to navigate his unpredictable moods and bizarre habits. The man who had once commanded millions of dollars per film was now spending his days in bed, watching old movies and consuming vast quantities of food, delivered by a steady stream of servants. But those closest to him during his final years also witnessed moments of startling clarity and vulnerability. Freed from the pressure of maintaining his public image, Brando sometimes allowed his masks to slip completely. He would speak with heartbreaking honesty about his regrets, his failures as a father, and his lifelong search for something that always seemed just out of reach. His death was both shocking and inevitable. Shocking because, despite his obvious health problems, he had seemed indestructible, a force of nature that would somehow endure forever. Inevitable because he had been slowly killing himself for so long that his passing felt like the completion of a decades-long suicide attempt conducted in slow motion and full public view. The official cause of death was listed as pulmonary fibrosis. But those who knew him understood that Marlon Brando had actually died of complications from a lifetime of being unable to figure out how to live authentically in his own skin. He had mastered the art of being everyone except himself. And ultimately, that mastery had cost him everything. In the years since Marlon Brando's death, his influence on acting, cinema, and popular culture has only grown more profound. Every mumbled line, every naturalistic gesture, Every moment of raw emotional honesty in contemporary film can be traced back to the revolution he started on that December night in 1947 when Stanley Kowalski first prowled across a Broadway stage. But perhaps Brando's most important legacy isn't artistic, it's human. In an era of manufactured celebrity and calculated public personas, Brando's life stands as both a cautionary tale and an inspiration. He showed us what was possible when someone refused to accept the limitations of conventional performance, both on stage and in life. But he also demonstrated the terrible cost of living without a stable sense of self. The tragedy and triumph of Marlon Brando's life is that he spent decades teaching the world about authentic emotion while being unable to access that authenticity. In his own relationships, he revolutionized how men could be vulnerable and complex on screen, while remaining locked in patterns of behavior that prevented real vulnerability in his personal life. He became the model for generations of actors who sought to bring truth to their performances, even as he struggled to find truth in his own existence. Today, as we grapple with questions of identity, authenticity, and mental health that were largely invisible during Brando's era, his story feels more relevant than ever. His struggles with eating disorders, sexual identity, family trauma, and the isolation of fame are issues that contemporary society is finally learning to discuss openly. In many ways, Brando was fighting battles that were only now beginning. To understand, the hidden life of Marlon Brando, finally exposed, reveals not a monster or a saint, but something more valuable, a deeply human being who happened to possess extraordinary gifts. His failures don't diminish his achievements. They make them more precious because we understand the cost at which they came. We close the book on Marlon Brando's hidden life. We're left not with answers but with a deeper appreciation for the complexity of human existence. Here was a man who gave us some of cinema's most truthful moments while living a life built on carefully constructed lies, who taught us about authentic emotion while struggling to understand his own feelings, who portrayed family loyalty and love with stunning conviction, while being unable to sustain either in his own relationships. The secrets we've uncovered don't make Brando smaller, they make him more real. His struggles with identity, addiction, trauma, and the burden of extraordinary talent remind us that genius doesn't protect anyone from the fundamental challenges of being human. If anything, it seems to intensify them. Perhaps that's why Brando's performances still move us so deeply decades after his death. When we watch him on screen, whether as the wounded Terry Malloy, the powerful Don Corleone, or the desperate Stanley Kowalski, we're not just watching acting. We're watching a man who understood pain so intimately that he could transform it into art. Marlon Brando's hidden life, finally exposed, teaches us that authenticity isn't about perfection, it's about the courage to be imperfect in front of others. He may not have mastered that courage in his personal relationships, but he gave it to us through his work. And that gift continues to resonate with anyone who has ever struggled to figure out who they really are beneath all the masks we wear. What do you think? Did Brando's personal struggles make his performances more powerful, or did they ultimately limit what he could achieve? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more deep dives into the hidden lives of Hollywood's greatest legends.